Dr. Alex Camardelle is the president of the Policy and Research of Atlanta Wealth Building Initiative. What Dr. Camardelle does there is he develops and oversees the mission-aligned advocacy and research agendas related to strategic initiatives and activities. He also serves as a co-investigator for poverty research at the National African American Child and Family Research Center housed at Morehouse School of Medicine. Dr. Camardelle also serves as a senior policy analyst for economic mobility at the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute, where his research and advocacy supports policy addressed with economic development, criminalization of research, supported by policy addressing social work, justice, access to core safety network programs. He also has worked with the Annie E. Casey Foundation, where he is responsible for strengthening economic opportunity through research, grant making, and partnerships. Dr. Camardelle also serves on the board of directors at the National Skills of Coalition, an organization that advocates and removes barriers for high quality training and employment services through policy change. Dr. Camardelle also works with the Center for Nonprofit. He's also recognized as one of, in 2017, under the 30 and 30 distinct professionals who are making powerful impact in Atlanta by exhibiting outstanding leadership, innovation, and commitment to their community and work. He is also a part of Georgia State University's 40 and 40 alumni class. Dr. Camardelle also holds a BA in political science from the University of Alabama and a graduate of Georgia State University, where he earned his Master of Public Administration degree. I think this is also important. He's a member of Phi Beta fraternity, Phi Beta Sigma. My son is also a member, so I'm gonna shout that out. So I'm very proud of that. He lives in Atlanta with his partner, Ricky, and his Jaburbian Shepsky, Zora. So I'm gonna turn this over to Dr. Alex Camardelle. He's gonna frame our day of why reform makes dollars and cents.
Good morning. Yeah. Sorry, while we get that set up, just want to thank everybody for being here today. I'm excited to be here. It's been some time since I've been at Justice Day. I'm not new to using music stands. I'm a musician myself, so it's just been a long time. But first and foremost, like was stated earlier, I'm Alex Camardelle. I'm the Vice President of Policy and Research at the Atlanta Wealth Building Initiative. I want to thank the JRP for having me today. I haven't participated in Justice Day or any Talk Justice Tuesday events since pre-pandemic, since before 2020. I'm actually also on the board of directors for Forever Family, which is a nonprofit, national nonprofit organization that supports children of incarcerated parents and their caregivers. And the last time that I was participating in a JRP series of events was a caregiver advocacy day, where I actually conspired with the incomparable and triumphant Marissa McCall-Dotson to organize caregiver advocacy and training throughout the day here at the Capitol. And just want to mention that because those are the feelings that I'm carrying with me and as I come into this space today. And I know we all miss her deeply on days like this as well. So, but I'm grateful to have the opportunity to kick off the day today. And to do that, I just want to take a few moments to ground us in some much needed context. Is that all right? Let me make sure we'll just hold this. So people who know me, and we can go to the next slide. So people who know me know that I love to talk about data. I'm kind of the data guy. I'm always about research and throwing a bunch of numbers out there. So I'm gonna do that, but I also like to contextualize that data in our history, right? That is vital to understanding why we're here talking about justice reform, as we're dealing with a system that has a long and troubled history, not just in Atlanta or Georgia, but around the world. First, I'll share a bit about AWBI. It's a nonprofit intermediary organization creating programs to develop research and advocates for policies that intend to build Black wealth in Atlanta and across the South. I'm deeply connected to the South. I was born and raised here, and I have no intention to leave. I grew up in Alabama on the Gulf Coast, and I've since lived in Mississippi, Louisiana, Georgia now, and all of these are places that have bloated prison budgets, but slim funding for vital social services, including public education, housing, and even more. Some of the work I get to lead at AWBI is about calling out states for those lopsided investments and policies that fuel economic inequality, which is a continuation of work that I did at the Joint Center just before, as well as at the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute and other former gigs. The next slide. So since my work is centered on Black Americans, we have a duty to understand the historical currents that resulted in the economic, social, and political conditions that we see today. Moreover, we have to understand that anti-Black racism is the basis for the corrupt and unjust system that we have today, hence the subject of my remarks. So I hope we could all kind of start there and all agree that that's the basis for the system that we have today. So to start us off, I want to explore with you all some historical currents that have shaped today's criminal legal system and that impede economic justice for disproportionately Black communities. Contrary to growing popular belief in some state legislatures, it's important to understand how we got here, as opposed to designing colorblind solutions that fail to account for the structural barriers that are predicated on this country's complex, horrific relationship with racism. And so this quote from Du Bois, to me, it summarizes the centuries-long struggle that continues today and has been prolonged by the intersecting forces of mass incarceration, labor, and economic liberation. And I'll read it because I know it's difficult to see. The history of the American Negro is the history of strife. This longing to attain self-consciousness, manhood, to merge his double self into a better and truer self. He simply wishes to make it possible for a man to be both a Negro and an American, without being cursed and spit upon by his fellows, without having the doors of opportunity closed roughly in his face. Next slide. So here are just a few historical strands important to understanding how we got to where we are today. So after slavery was abolished in 1865, and excuse me again for the history lesson, most of this is stuff that you all probably know, Southern states were among more than 90% Black Americans were living there, embraced policing and imprisonment as a means of racial control. Discriminatory Black codes came into play after 1865 and led to the imprisonment of unprecedented numbers of Black men, women, and children who were returned to slavery-like conditions through forced labor and convict leasing, systems that lasted well into the 20th century. The intent of these laws was to restrict African Americans' freedom and compel them to work for white employers in a situation that was reminiscent of slavery. Jim Crow laws came later down the line and enforced racial segregation in southern United States and remained in force until 1965, well into the lives of some of us who are in this room today. And during this period, Black Americans were relegated to second-class citizenship. And now, as you all may have heard, we're living in what is popularly referred to as the new Jim Crow. These are new forms of racialized social control were created through the ongoing war on drugs, which allowed policymakers to remove those explicit messages that were racialized and replace them with tough on crime messages and created incentives, including massively increased funding for policing in Black communities, which drove disparate outcomes in incarceration among Black and white perpetrators. Next slide. And as a result of these laws that reinforced the color line, which extended to criminal justice, employment, housing, education, and other domains of everyday life, the United States continues to wrestle with what some refer to as a racial caste system. And Black Americans are positioned at the bottom of the caste system, largely as a result of our mass incarceration system. Next slide. And these historical currents have created a reality where we see stark disproportionate rates of incarceration among Black Americans who are overrepresented in our jails and prisons. Take, for example, in Georgia, though only 32% of the state's population is Black, they make up 60% of Georgia's total prison population. This is an extreme rate of disproportionality that speaks to deeply ingrained structural problems that can only be resolved through race-conscious policies. Next slide. We have discriminatory criminal justice policies and practices at all stages of the justice process that have unjustifiably disadvantaged Black people, including through disparities in the enforcement of seemingly race-neutral laws. Studies have found that Black people are more likely to be stopped by police, detained pretrial, charged with more serious crimes, and sentenced more harshly than white people, even when controlling for things like the severity of the offense. Let's take policing, for example. Police have been seen more likely to pull over people of color for what researchers call investigatory stops. Once pulled over, Black people and Hispanics are 3 times as likely as whites to be searched, and Black people are twice as likely as whites to be arrested during a traffic stop. Prosecutors are more likely to charge people of color with crimes that carry heavier sentences than whites. Federal prosecutors, for example, are twice likely to charge Black Americans with offenses that carry mandatory minimum sentences than otherwise similar whites. State prosecutors are also more likely to charge Black rather than similar white defendants under what are referred to as habitual offender laws. And last but not least, we have our judges. Judges are more likely to sentence people of color than whites to prison and jail and to give them longer sentences, even after accounting for differences in crime severity and criminal history. For instance, young Black men are perceived as being more dangerous in sentencing simply because of their race and socioeconomic characteristics. Next slide. So sadly, incarceration has become a replacement for state welfare and a way of avoiding the treatment of problems such as homelessness, drug abuse, mental illness, low literacy, and poverty as social problems. And that's reflected in the way that we actually fund our incarceration system, the way that we fund our social services. And I have to give a plug to my buddy here, Ray, with the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute, who does a great job of regularly tracking those investments. So if you haven't seen their budget work, looking at the Georgia Department of Corrections, I definitely recommend checking that out. Next slide. So next I want to get into a little bit on legal discrimination and reentry. So I'm focusing on what's been what has evolved into legal discrimination. Arrests and subsequent incarceration have really far-reaching consequences on individuals and their families. And for those who bear this mark of quote-unquote ex-offender, they're virtually excluded in every facet of life that offers access to economic opportunity upon their release. Work and income are chief among them. So the stigma of a record, it actually lessens access to jobs with livable wages, stable and supportive housing, and in some states, the complete exclusion from voting. And as you can see in this slide here, this is pronounced for formerly incarcerated Black folks, or maybe you cannot see it. But what it's showing here is that Black folks who were formerly incarcerated, both Black men and Black women, have the highest unemployment rates after release. And this is a result of stigma and bad policies. They work hand in hand to create a legal system of labor discrimination that follows formerly incarcerated Black workers that are looking for quality employment for the rest of their lives. Next slide. So you may ask yourself, well, discrimination can't be legal. We changed laws to fix that. We had the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It supposedly made any form of discrimination illegal in the US today. So it's commonly argued that discrimination is not possible in a free market economy either, and then so we default on the exclusion of some groups of people as a result of skills deficits, that they come from a bad home, they're coming from a fatherless home, all of these other attributions that are not necessarily rooted in structural evidence. But there is substantive evidence, that the color line is still persistent in determining unemployment outcomes, earnings outcomes, and in other areas of the economic system, outcomes of well-being. So instead, we've shifted overt discriminatory practices to what some refer to, and what I like to refer to as stealth institutional racism. And this is particularly pronounced when examining the impact of criminal records and hiring. So I'll focus on that as an example for the next couple of slides, considering a huge focus of this coalition, the Justice Reform Partnership, and some of the bills being advocated for this session seek to eliminate the impact of a record on access to good jobs. Next slide. So what do we know? So criminal records sort workers within racial groups, giving preference to workers without a history of incarceration. Criminal legal institutions undermine access to jobs by disrupting employment, degrading skills, and marking people for stigmatization and exclusion based on past convictions through both private employer screening and state occupational licensing restrictions. And because Black folks are already treated disparately in policing and sentencing, and thus overrepresented in prisons, the burden of a record weighs most heavily on Black communities. And this steers formerly incarcerated Black workers to the bottom of the economy, sometimes locking them out of economic mobility and wealth altogether. Next slide. So, despite the evidence, for some reason, accounts of racial discrimination still seem really elusive to folks. So for example, many reports attempt to claim racial disparities, like I mentioned, are just a result of skills deficits or human capital discrepancies or due to the collateral consequences of incarceration. And these items may explain just a portion of employment and earnings differences between Black Americans and other racial groups. But pervasive racialized discriminatory practices in hiring continue to play a role. For instance, just by allowing employers to access conviction records leads to racial discrimination. The EEOC, or the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, found that the use of convictions as a screening tool carries a disparate effect because Black Americans are convicted at higher rates. Legal racist hiring practices simply hurt Black job seekers impacted by mass incarceration twofold. The public access to a record, in addition to requiring applicants to share whether they have a record on job applications, leads to higher rates of discrimination among Black job seekers. White men with a criminal record are more likely to get interviewed for jobs than Black men with no criminal record. So the game is rigged even whenever you do play by the rules. Next slide. And beyond the employment and the records issues, the effects of mass incarceration on the economic security and wealth of households with incarcerated loved ones is severe. On average, a total of $370 billion is lost annually by people who have criminal convictions or spend time in prison. This is on top of the nearly $200 billion that our government spends to incarcerate people every year. So in all, this is nearly $500 billion lost to a system that is almost exclusively self-serving. And these losses are felt by the whole family, not just the incarcerated individuals. So for instance, the median wealth of Black households with an incarcerated family member is just about a stack, $1,100, compared to $15,000 for white households with an incarcerated family member. So the system is actively contributing to worsening the racial wealth divide. Next slide. And that discrimination doesn't just stop in the labor market, it also extends to our public safety net system and housing, and of course, we all know, to our democracy as well. I always like to lift up that we have a public benefit system that is not supportive of formerly incarcerated individuals. For instance, SNAP and TANF for food stamps and cash assistance. These are vital work supports to help low-income workers have income to support themselves and their families when they return to their communities, but there are prohibitions across the country that prevent formerly incarcerated individuals from accessing these vital work supports. Next slide. So I'm wrapping up here, but wanted to just mention this. So since 2012, and this chart is also difficult to see, but this is that wonderful chart that I think a lot of us have seen, just highlighting that Georgia has the highest number of folks under correctional control in the nation. Since 2012, Georgia's lawmakers passed more than a dozen major criminal justice reform bills aimed at reducing incarceration rates and saving the state money. But over that same time period, Georgia became a leader in the number of individuals under correctional control, primarily because of individuals on probation, doubled the state budget for probation, reduced the number of individuals approved for parole by nearly half, all while the number of people in state and private prisons on average has largely gone unchanged. So I've called Georgia a leader in criminal justice reform. You know, we were the first state in the South to ban the box. You know, we have made so many inroads in terms of record restriction, and we're still making a lot of progress there. But when I look at this slide, I just think to myself, the math ain't mathing. Something's not adding up. So next slide. I'll just mention briefly some solutions. because I know that the day will be filled with some more pointed and direct recommendations. But some ideas mostly focused on reentry include developing clear and public second chance hiring policies. We want employers to be transparent about their willingness and organizational commitment to work with formerly incarcerated individuals without further stigmatizing them. And then we need public policy to support employers to make those choices, instead of incentivizing them to participate in a discriminatory practice. We want to target investment for job creation and recruitment in communities that have high rates of returning citizens, particularly in communities of color. A large share of formerly incarcerated Black folks return back to their home community. And oftentimes those communities, due to decades of underinvestment in education and anti-poverty programs, employment, and residential segregation, those are the root causes of disproportionate incarceration in Black communities. So employers and policymakers should invest in outreach and recruitment directly in those communities. Also, partner with people who have direct experience in the criminal legal system to develop inclusive practices and policies regarding rehabilitation and hiring and retention and promotion. And then we have to constantly evaluate our practices and policies to make sure that they're working. Next slide. So this is tough to see too, but before I leave you, and after just throwing up a bunch of research and numbers, I wanted to humanize myself a little bit. So on this slide, it's difficult to see, but this is me and my younger brother, William. William moved to Atlanta in 2016 and has spent the early part of his 20s incarcerated in Georgia state prisons since 2019. My brother, as well as myself and our family, we're all on a healing journey, and it is full of peaks and valleys. One year, he's 3 hours away. Another year, he's relocated 5 hours away. It's incredibly expensive to stay in touch with loved ones, as I'm sure some of you know. We have to have a separate savings account just to make routine phone calls, to make those road trips happen. And, sorry, y'all. The news of mistreatment, budget cuts to rehabilitation, suicide and violence in Georgia prisons means there's a constant dark cloud hovering over us all every day. But I'm encouraged that all of us in this room are here to make sure that when he returns home, and he will, that he has rich opportunities to thrive in Georgia and beyond. And it is up to us to make that happen. It can't be on him. And my gut tells me we're here because we've either been in the system ourselves or we love someone who has. And it's that love that compels us to show up and work in a system that is often deemed unworkable, unfixable, just like the people within it are deemed unworkable and unfixable. So I just want to leave you with that. I want to think about humanizing the people that we're here to support and work in service with. And just keep that in top of your mind as you advocate for a better future for my brother and for all of our loved ones today. Thank you.